I wanted to read you something I wrote for you. It's called The Great Life of Benjamin Brain.
My whole life I've spent in this shit around us. And I ain't going back.
Makes you think I want out of here.
Eventually, you gotta move on and live your life. Find your destiny.
Alex, Dad lost his job.
Your mother could see you now.
I don't want to hear about Mom.
Babe!
But I have lost people too.
You have no idea what loss is.
No way! You are my number one priority now. You are all that matters to me.
And you must be better than me. Understand?
I don't know what to do.
Yes, you do.
A single-player game will never be remembered if it lacks a compelling story. It can have the most visually impressive graphics and the most addictive gameplay, but without a good story, the urge in finishing is non-existent. This is why narrative-focused games are proven to have a higher completion rate than those that aren't. The incorporation of a narrative allows the player to be fully immersed. It allows them to develop an emotional connection with the characters and the world that they play in. Games without a strong narrative or a narrative at all are often forgotten years later, as there's always a game that will replace it eventually.
Happy birthday, kiddo.
What is this?
This is a thing that took a mighty effort to find. Take it.
Many recent game titles such as The Last of Us Part 2, the new God of War games, and Marvel's Spider-Man for the PlayStation all have impressive completion rates. Completion rates being the number of players that have finished the main story. 50 to 60% of players that started those games finish them, and it doesn't take much to figure out why. Each game had a compelling story to the average player, ones that made gamers want to continue to chip away at the campaigns. Story games like the ones mentioned deliver in a multitude of ways. While not complex, the gameplay is both accessible and enjoyable to the general gaming audience. But what makes the gameplay all the better is the story that's paired with it. Many moments during these games where characters you love are harmed give weight to the game levels that follow. Like seeing another god harm your son in front of you. It changes the feel of the combat dramatically, as each swing you make is filled with rageful revenge. To put it simply, these games have high completion rates because they're highly engaging. But then we look at games with low completion rates. In those, we notice a pattern that is quite the opposite. If we take a look at Hogwarts Legacy across all platforms, a game title that was released this year, we'll find that on average only 34% of players completed the game, the lowest percentage being on Steam with 29%. It isn't an online game, it's single player, and while there's great praise for the in-game mechanics and combat, very little praise goes to the story. For many players, the story was the weak point of the game, which is a shame since the IP is one of the largest in pop culture today. Another title with a low completion rate is Elden Ring, which won Game of the Year back in 2022. On Steam, the game only holds a 20% completion rate, which is rather odd as the game was in constant discussion amongst gamers for months after the release. It's understandable that it's a different type of game, one that focuses more on combat mechanics. And the combat isn't exactly for everyone. Many fans of the game point out that the game is more focused on the lore of the world rather than the story. And if that's something that you prefer, then nothing can change that. But lore does not equal story. Lore gives background to the world around you, whereas the story provides a plot that gives meaning to everything you do. It's rather disappointing since the game had the works of George R.R. Martin attached to it. With such a richly detailed world, it's a shame that only a thin story was the result. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Can we really use the validity of completion rates to determine how engaging a game is? If a player buys a game and only plays for 2 minutes or requests a refund for it, the game still counts that into the completion rate. So, in theory, Elden Ring and Hogwarts Legacy's low completion rates could be due to those reasons. But to that, I ask, if that's the case, how are the completion rates so high for games like Spider-Man or The Last of Us? Could it be because there weren't as many returns as there were for games like Hogwarts and Elden Ring? And if that's the case, then at that point it's a matter of quality.
Bitch took off without a word. Fucking whore walked out on me for a fucking accountant!
Gameplay is obviously a requirement when it comes to a game, but a story gives it purpose.
What are you doing?
Protocol 3. I will not lose another pilot.
While I personally prefer story over gameplay, a game should at least be able to strike a perfect balance.
You are everything I wanted to be!
It's why games like God of War, The Last of Us, and the recent Spider-Man games have resonated so well with players from all over the world. They told stories that were easy to get behind and filled them with well-written characters that felt real. It made the combat and action sequences all the more engaging because you cared about the characters you controlled. The story gives meaning to the combat, and the combat adds to the immersion as you, the player, execute the action. For that is the goal of a game, to immerse and entertain.